So every now and again, I see some cyclically viral tweets, or I guess posts, about the 1998 movie Rush Hour, along with its sequel. We don't really talk about the third one.
You down with that, Snoopy? That's dope, ain't it?
But what I find interesting about these discussions is how the admittedly racist jokes littered throughout the films are often considered the best part. It's especially bewildering because this take pops up again and again in the angry cesspool that is Twitter. Even as these movies written by white guys perpetuate every stereotype imaginable, to the point it necessitates a disclaimer about how it was a different time before being aired on TV, so many Black and Asian Americans, including myself, still look back at the films fondly.
It was an instant classic in Black circles because Jackie Chan is a legend, and because at the time, Chris Tucker was looking to be like the next Eddie Murphy. But yeah, so like it was an immediate, really solid hood classic is what we might call it. Now, I'm always fearful of watching movies I enjoyed in the 90s for like how X, Y, and Z things translate in 2023. So like I hold any and all criticism for insert whatever problematic thing here is in the movie. But overall, in the moment, it was a mega hit, at least from where I was.
Rush Hour was a buddy cop film, widely remembered for being Jackie Chan's breakthrough into Hollywood and a big part of Chris Tucker's ascent as an A-list leading man. It spawned a franchise spanning 3 movies grossing over $800 million in the box office, and also a canceled TV show nobody talks about.
This is unacceptable. You speak English?
Not to mention, it's the reason Rotten Tomatoes exists. Its founder had created a database of reviews of Jackie Chan's Hong Kong films, and in anticipation of Rush Hour, he coded the website 2 weeks before its planned release. All this to say, the Rush Hour franchise was a big deal. Plus, it was one of very few Hollywood movies to star 2 non-white leads of differing races, and I think it tapped into something unspoken about the dynamic between Black and Asian American communities and how they interact, whether it meant to or not. In this video, I want to dig deeper in regards to how this dynamic has been depicted in mainstream media, and Rush Hour in particular. Also, while I'll do my best to be nuanced and considerate, I can only perceive things from my own experience, so I can't speak for all Asian people, and I definitely can't speak for Black people on this topic. It seems the most pervasive ongoing narrative is that there's been nothing but contention between these communities in America. And while that's definitely not entirely wrong, I think Rush Hour accidentally offered a different glimpse of this relationship that hasn't really been reflected much elsewhere. Like I said, Rush Hour stars the unlikely duo of Jackie Chan as Chief Inspector Lee and Chris Tucker as Detective James Carter. On the surface, it's a pretty straightforward buddy cop film, with decent action sequences, funny quips, and plenty of dramatic explosions. When I first watched it as a kid, I didn't understand all the humor, but I found it incredibly funny and quotable nonetheless. My second grade teacher can attest to this. That being said, with rumors of a Rush Hour 4, I'm cautiously intrigued about how they'd even make it work in the 2020s, because
I've been looking for your sweet and sour chicken ass. Chinese food, no soul food here. You must know my good friend Pedro Morales, Gonzalez, Marato, Monazo, Modestos. Do you speak any English?
it was a lot of this. And then Jackie calls room service, "Can I have some fried chicken, please?" Like, and
so that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. See, that's so low hanging. White people think the difference is that shallow, because I feel like Chris Tucker had to do some riffing, but they probably had to feed Jackie Chan his stuff.
Oh,
you know
yeah.
what I'm saying?
They were feeding him stuff he didn't even know what he was saying half the time. When he said the N-word in the first one, I don't think he knew.
Oh yes, I forgot about that. Yeah. Oh God. Oh, now I gotta go back and watch it and see how badly it survives.
I really appreciate FD coming through to discuss the film with me. He's a great video essayist with a compassionate and nuanced approach. So you'll see him crop up here and there throughout the video giving his perspective. But before we get into that, I want to talk about how we're trying to improve the quality of our videos here on Quality Culture. We're really excited to have Skillshare as a sponsor for this video. It's an online learning platform with thousands of classes to help you develop all kinds of skills. The reason we started this channel in the first place was to have a creative outlet. There's been a lot of learning curves along the way, and we're still learning, so Skillshare has been an incredibly valuable resource. Currently, we're trying to brush up on our editing. In this video, you might notice we use some pointers from a class about masking transitions. And now that the channel has become more than a hobby, we can use Skillshare to learn more about the business and marketing side of things as well. But we use it for hobbies too. I like making beats, and you might have heard some in the background of some of our videos. So I've been looking into classes for the music program I use. And Steph likes to draw and take photos, so she's been taking advantage of the tons of art and photography classes. There's really no limit to what you can learn. There's classes for all levels of expertise, so you'll find something helpful whether you're a beginner or a pro. Plus, there's a whole supportive community of learners there alongside you. If you want to join Skillshare and learn something new, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial. So check them out, and thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring. Now back to the video. Before Rush Hour, Jackie Chan was already an international star and the highest grossing actor in Asia and Europe due to his Hong Kong films like Drunken Master, Police Story, and Rumble in the Bronx. He choreographed a unique form of stunts and fight sequences that were at times both hilarious and breathtaking, drawing from Charlie Chaplin as much as he did Bruce Lee. The chaotic fights usually involved a quirk, like the staggering movements of Drunken Master and the use of regular household items as weapons. He made a name for himself by meticulously choreographing scenes until they were perfect, going through hours and hours of film to get the smallest details just right.
For one shot, more than 120 takes. When you see it in 2 minutes or 1 second, if, oh, Jackie, good. It's not good. You can do it. Except, do you have the patience or not?
Yet, he struggled to gain a footing in the North American market. In Rush Hour, the director even deliberately reused gags from Jackie's previous movies, believing most American audiences weren't familiar with them.
Hi.
But after Rumble in the Bronx was released in the US in 1996, it gradually attained cult status and fell in the hands of now disgraced director Brett Ratner. You can look into why he's so disgraced if you want, but otherwise, let's just all agree that the guy's a piece of shit and move on. After watching Rumble in the Bronx, Ratner wanted to make a buddy cop movie with Jackie as a co-lead, not just a sidekick. This was especially significant because up until this point, Asian actors, domestic or foreign, were historically pushed to the side in favor of white actors. Not to mention the many occasions when Asian roles were simply given to white actors putting on yellowface. For Jackie, his motivations weren't purely financial, although it definitely didn't hurt. In a Herald Times interview, he said, "Don't forget, it's not for the money, it's for the face. You know Chinese, always face." What he's referring to is saving face, because despite his years of success around the globe, he still wanted to make a name in Hollywood. And due to this, he was willing to make concessions regarding his work process and filmmaking sensibilities. Later, he would admit that he's not the biggest fan of the Rush Hour films, simply because he doesn't really get the humor.
On the set, I don't understand. This speaks the English so fast. Okay, let Jackie say that. I said, what? Then after I say it, everybody laughing. I still don't understand what that means. I like the one with the horses. What's that mean? Why he teach me?
While he maintained his rigorous work ethic, he entrusted Ratner's expertise in portraying him favorably to an American audience.
Action.
In this case, it was through a buddy cop film with Chris Tucker. At the time, Tucker was an ascending star in Hollywood, with memorable stand-up performances on Def Jam Comedy, as well as roles in Friday, The Fifth Element, and Jackie Brown. Rush Hour wouldn't necessarily be his big break, but it would solidify his status as a bankable leading actor in big-budget films.
After I did Money Talks with him, I called him up and I said, "Chris, I want to do a movie with Jackie Chan. I have an idea to put you and him together." He goes, "I love Jackie Chan, I'll do the movie, no problem, I'll do it." What I told him is, I said, the script isn't good, but I know what to do with it. I know if I put you two guys in a typical American buddy picture, it's gonna work.
Buddy films have pretty much always been a staple in Hollywood, often featuring opposing black and white co-leads. These films didn't always explicitly focus on race, but they inherently played off these experiential differences. An LA Times article describes these on-screen interactions, saying, "The key to buddy movies is chemistry that derives from opposites attract. It's why so many modern-day buddy films pair up black and white actors. The stark contrast in racial style gives the movie an extra kick." But what made Rush Hour stand out was that it starred two differing minority leads, something we rarely see.
You don't have to be Tom Cruise. You don't have to be Tom Hanks to have a movie that performs. You don't need to have a white Anglo-Saxon all-American star to have a hit movie.
Knowing all of this, Rush Hour wasn't really trying to represent realistic people or defy stereotypes. It purposefully invited the audience to pigeonhole the two leads into racial tropes. In the series, Lee is a respected detective sent to America to find the kidnapped daughter of a Chinese diplomat. Fearing an international incident, the FBI pawned him off to the LAPD, who assigns Detective James Carter to keep Lee away from the case.
Yeah, I understand you want me to babysit somebody, but I don't do that. I came down here for the big assignment.
When the characters meet, there's immediately a clash of personalities and cultures.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Lee serves as the straight man to Carter's eccentricities, but their dynamics play into real-life stereotypes regarding their ethnicities. Lee is emblematic of the inscrutable, stoic Asian and lost foreigner. Meanwhile, Carter's slick-talking, street-savvy characterization reflects what Ratner describes as hip-hop culture. The juxtaposition between the two is made clear through obvious social and cultural gaps.
Ever touch a black man's radio, boy? You can do that in China, but you can get your ass killed out here, man.
For all of today's discussions and outrage about proper representation, 25 some years ago, they just had an Asian guy and a black guy play into all the stereotypes you could think of and called it a day. The franchise seemed to take any chance it could to make a racist joke.
No wonder you, man. Sorry, man. Oh, y'all look alike.
Usually at the expense of Lee, and usually coming from Carter. And it may come as a shock to those who cry about modern woke culture, but yes, the racial humor did anger many Asian Americans at the time too. Many saw it as yet another example of Asians being othered and mocked in media. A Washington Post article chronicles the many differing sentiments from Asian American moviegoers, including Juju Lin, executive director of Chicago's Asian American Institute, who said, "I walked away feeling entertained on one hand, but also having a knot in my stomach. It is a shame that Hollywood could not stay away from the cheap racial humor. It would still be entertaining without doing that sort of thing, without perpetuating the stereotypes." But the same article notes how some Asian Americans didn't see much issue with the portrayals, and even viewed it as progress. Nancy Tom, founder of the Center for Asian Arts and Media at Columbia College, and also the mother of one of the actresses in the Joy Luck Club, said they each were a stereotype. But it was such a light comedy way that I did not find it offensive at all. But what we need is more exposure in other areas, even if it's just a fourth of an inch. Blacks have these types of movies, but they also have movies like Soul Food and Love Jones. We have not had anything since the Joy Luck Club. These few and far between depictions continue to inform the general public's perception of us, and many Asian Americans yearn for them to be more than just stereotypes of their race. And side note, this especially goes for how women are depicted throughout the franchise. All of the films fall in line with action movie tropes of damsels in distress, femme fatales, and eye candy. This wouldn't be so egregious if it wasn't for the gross way the franchise views almost every woman in an excessively objectifying way, especially as it fetishizes Asian women. These parts are honestly pretty uncomfortable to watch now, but I guess it makes sense considering Ratner turned out to be a scumbag. So I get why some people weren't happy with the humor in Rush Hour. And no matter how I feel or how some other Asian individual feels about it, it won't be reflective of how everyone thinks. We all have our own opinions, and these huge groups of people aren't a monolith. But as one of the young people that watched these movies, I never felt the jokes were malicious, no matter how deep it got.
I'll bitch you back to Africa.
Oh, you will? Yeah. Well, come on, let me see that.
Because out of context, a clip like that seems pretty indefensible. But in the context of the film, it's friends clapping back at each other.
Don't be messing with me, Lee. I will slap you so hard you end up in the Ming Dynasty.
Again, I realize Rush Hour was written by a bunch of white guys, so it's easy for them to write these characters being friendly and buddy-buddy despite the things they say. But the dynamic is realistic in how male friends tend to talk to each other. Regarding this kind of bond, George Gallo, story writer for Bad Boys, said, "Men in general forgive verbal abuse a lot easier, maybe because we attack each other in a very focused way. I could say some pretty horrible things to a guy and then 20 minutes later go off and have a beer together. And if you ever been around the bros, this kind of banter is normal."
The way our masculinity is set up here in America, in the West, you don't just get to say, "I love you, I appreciate your companionship, you're my friend." You have to talk shit and wrap that in negativity and understand that that's what that means, right? But that happens with trust. When you're friends with someone and when you all share community and share problems and share perspective, then I can give you the grace and trust that that greasy thing you just said to me did not come from a place of harm. And across race, it's possible. I wouldn't have participated much in that, but I don't begrudge, people that have that wavelength. And it shows when you know how to engage in that type of humor with a level of expertise.
At the root of their friendship is their own relationship to masculinity. They chase girls together, risk their lives together, and even relate in the fact that both of their fathers were killed while on duty. And because of these factors, there's an understanding that deep down, they care for each other. A Washington Post article notes, research dating back to the 1990s suggests that for boys, underhanded remarks are a sign of trust, acceptance, and belonging, a rule that does not generally apply to girls.
And so, yes, this movie does kind of speak to the bonding nature of patriarchy. You know what I'm saying? Of how patriarchy has ordained for men and boys ways in which to create intimate connections with each other. And it's mostly through toxic and or destructive behavior. But they're both involved with this, like, they both have a task to do something to accomplish something. So they have a goal, they work together, they build camaraderie, they build trust in, working through each other's strengths and weaknesses and relying on each other. Like, there's value to that. And that's a thing that, we need to be critical of still, but also the idea of creating found family and brotherhood and talking through pain, talking through loss with other men.
Maybe you could consider these microaggressions or just straight up aggressions. Maybe it's emblematic of toxic masculinity that men and boys feel that they have to tease and tear each other down to form friendships. But what it boils down to on a real world level is this is how many men are able to show solidarity and unity. Of course, there's a line that can be crossed, and I really can't tell you where that line is since it's different for everyone. For me, and a lot of people who still remember the Rush Hour franchise fondly, I didn't get the feeling these jokes were mean-spirited for the most part. If anything, some of the jokes are just so over the top and ridiculous, it's tough to even think about them that seriously. I think at its core, that's what fans of the franchise gravitate to. This rough around the edges friendship where two guys feel comfortable enough to mercilessly say the worst things imaginable to each other, because at the end of the day, they know they have each other's back. I can't say for sure if it's healthy, but it's definitely a dynamic a lot of men can attest translates to a solid and meaningful bond. However, this friendship between Lee and Carter occurs in spite of what we know about the perceived relationship between Black and Asian people in the real world. Rush Hour came out during a particularly divisive time in America, so I think it's worth understanding the context. The 90s saw the bubbling of racial tensions in the US. While most of us probably remember this being solely related to police brutality and disparities in the justice system, it was also a time where tensions between Asian and Black communities was at its highest. And this real-world tension indirectly informed audiences about what they should expect with a Black and Asian pairing on screen. You can sense some of this hostility with Carter as he initially treats Lee as a nuisance and verbalizes xenophobic lines you'd imagine your ignorant uncle might say.
First I get a bullshit assignment, now Mr. Rice-A-Roni don't even speak American.
It mirrors the rising animosity in Black communities regarding the increase of Asian immigrants in their neighborhoods. In the mid-1960s, laws barring undesirable immigrants were lifted and waves of Asians entered the US. And having limited means meant they moved into lower income Black neighborhoods. There they set up businesses among their new neighbors to what was initially a mostly harmonious relationship. But as Asian Americans quickly climbed the social ladder and became synonymous with the model minority label, resentment grew regarding their roles in these communities. Some Asian Americans resisted the model minority characterization, but many embraced the moniker as a compliment, considering the history of negative stereotypes of yellow peril that existed throughout the West, characterizing East and Southeast Asians as, quote, filthy yellow hordes. It's understandable they take a liking to a more favorable label. The same goes for the almost asexual depiction of many Asian men in media, as it contrasted the previous stereotype of Asian men being sexual deviants. Jackie Chan has even joked about this phenomenon, as he's been continually typecast as an action star devoid of any romantic appeal.
Slow motion, the bitch hugging with the girl, kissing, of good. But nobody hire me.
All this to say that these stereotypes seem to ebb and flow as Asian Americans were considered dirty and morally depraved foreigners one day and a model minority the next, conveniently being recharacterized as such during the Civil Rights Movement. But we'll put a pin in that. Regardless, a growing sentiment permeated Black communities. These Asian immigrants were leeching off of Black neighborhoods, taking jobs and opportunities away from prospective Black business owners and only using them for their own gain. The narrative was that these immigrants received federal loans that weren't afforded to Black Americans and essentially invaded these lower income neighborhoods without uplifting the communities they set up shop in. The notion that they received special loans has been disputed, so I'll put more info in the description. But either way, the perception stuck, and it came as a slap in the face to many Black Americans who time and again witnessed the US government limit their ability to prosper economically.
So you have Asian immigrants that come, they don't understand that there's a historical, the resources that initiate some of these Asian businesses in Black communities have never been made available to Black people. And so when they see that, there's a resentment that builds up. And there's like, we are sitting here in these communities struggling constantly, and the little money we have, we can only pay to people that own industries that don't look like us and that aren't investing back in our communities. They're sending it to their communities, which makes some sense, but also feels like pretty exploitative. On the flip side, they're like, yo, you know what I just went through leaving Vietnam, leaving South Korea, leaving Laos, leaving etc. Like, you know, I just left a dictator. I just left a genocide in Thailand or the Philippines. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not trying to hear your shit. I'm trying to save a whole other community of people. I ain't worried about you right now. And y'all are acting ridiculous in my store, so we gonna have a problem.
Speaking of this, there's a common feeling among Black patrons that they were being treated unfavorably by Asian store owners. It was a tension felt throughout the country, reflected in films and songs alike.
So don't follow me up and down your market, or your little chop suey ass will be a target.
Hurry up and buy!
20, motherfucker. 20.
Honey?
What the f*** you?
I'm no punk bitch. I ain't no punk bitch neither. I'm no punk bitch. There, knock that head up.
In response to this, several Black communities picketed and boycotted these stores. A Washington Post article from 1990 describes protesters in New York shouting, quote, "Fortune cookies say no money today," and bloodsuckers. The article notes how confrontations between Blacks and Koreans have flared since the early 1980s in other Brooklyn neighborhoods, in Harlem and Queens, and in Atlanta, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. You may have noticed these stories are often about Korean Americans rather than Asian Americans as a whole. But to be honest, we're all usually lumped under the same umbrella either way. The term Asian American was coined in the 60s by Asian grad students at UC Berkeley, and it gradually replaced the word Oriental, a term loaded with racist connotations. The broad phrase Asian American eventually encompassed dozens of varied cultures and identities in East, Southeast, and South Asia. But regardless of how different or similar each nationality was, Asians were almost always viewed and treated as one and the same in the US. Like when Japanese Americans were being forced into internment camps during World War II, other Asian Americans wore buttons displaying their nationalities to avoid being detained or attacked. And even in the Brooklyn boycott I mentioned earlier, there were reports of Vietnamese men being attacked because they were mistaken for Korean people. Yen Le Espiritu, professor of Asian American Studies at UC San Diego, put it simply: all that mattered was that you looked Asian. Tensions simmered throughout the decades, and by the early 90s, the friction between Black and Asian Americans reached a boiling point when 15-year-old Latasha Harlins was shot and killed by a Korean store owner in LA. The store owner was given a slap on the wrist, which, along with the continued police brutality evidenced by the Rodney King tape, led to the LA riots in 1992. Hundreds of shops were looted, vandalized, and destroyed, more than half of which were Korean-owned.
So, oh, we have a police here, we are safe. But as soon as the gun fighting started, they ran away. Bye.
I mean, can people realize what they're doing is wrong? This is not the way to overcome racism.
It was a dark moment in American history that told the world the relationship between Asian and Black Americans was solely defined by distrust and animosity. So yeah, 6 years later, this movie came out.
The fastest hands in the East. Wow. Meet the biggest mouth in the West.
The film purposefully plays into this racial divide, and it translates immediately during Lee and Carter's not-so-friendly meeting. Yet, they eventually become the best of friends. Naturally, this plays into the buddy trope, where the two leads start out disliking each other before forming a bond. It's a very Hollywood story arc that wraps everything in a perfect bow. Two people from opposite sides of the track figure out they aren't so different after all. The end. Kumbaya. Why can't we all get along? Sadly, it didn't exactly reflect reality. or even lead to a substantial difference in how characters could be paired in the future. For instance, in Romeo Must Die, the 2000 action movie starring Jet Li and Aaliyah, they were meant to kiss towards the end, but it didn't test well with audiences. Interestingly, black audiences were the main group that didn't approve of it. This could have a multitude of explanations that may not necessarily be anti-Asian, but still, it was another example of the two communities having clear lines drawn about how close they wanted to be. Even today, it's a touchy subject. For example, the discussion surrounding the rise of Asian hate crimes in America starting in 2020. Viral videos showed elderly Asian Americans being attacked in broad daylight, seemingly always at the hands of a black person, fueling the theory that animosity is the defining trait of this inter-minority relationship. I bring this up not to say both sides are equally at fault, or look how bad one side is, or anything like that, but to ask, why is it that we only consider these kinds of stories to be reflective of the truth? Don't get me wrong, I wish I could tell you all these tensions were a thing of the past or simply media fabrications, but there is animosity between these communities. A lot of Asian Americans do hold negative assumptions about Black Americans, and there's plenty of Asians who fully believe in the model minority label and see the struggle of other communities as being self-inflicted. On the flip side, from what I've read, plenty of Black Americans are indifferent to the issues of Asian Americans, and may even hold resentments about the rapid ascension of Asian immigrants up the social and economic ladder. So I'm not gonna pretend like these stereotypes are totally untrue, but I can tell you it's not the whole truth. The only thing we ever hear about is just how, for example, during COVID, how Asian people were only being attacked by Black people. Like, Black people are doing all of it, or 90% of it. And that's just not even true. It's just not true. But that's what we see. And that's the whole narrative. And then everyone buys into it. Through a little research, I continually found that the rise of Asian hate crimes wasn't carried out mostly by Black Americans. Statistically, the culprits of these attacks were most often white people. Yet it seems we're often fed narratives that only sow more needless division between our communities. And for the most part, we believe it. To get a better understanding of this, I read Civility in the City by Professor Jennifer Lee. In it, she studied the dynamics of Asian-owned stores in Black neighborhoods. Through her research, she found that the vast majority of interactions were ordinary and went off without a hitch, because of course they do. By the end of her research, she concluded, while media images highlight racial warfare, I find that most merchant-customer interactions are positive and civil. I discovered that civility prevails in everyday life, because merchants and their employees actively work to preserve it. Jewish and Korean merchants hire Black employees, place women at the front end of the business, and give in to customer demands to keep the business routine in place. By making these investments, merchants actively work to minimize altercations with customers and racially charged anger. Furthermore, the fact that the vast majority of merchant-customer interactions are free of conflict demonstrates that these interactions in themselves are not the source of hostility that leads to boycotts, violence, and riots. In the few instances where she did witness moments of conflict, they were often coded with racial hostility, even when race may have not been related to the issue at hand. Lee goes in depth about this, examining how these, quote, stock stories load simple economic arguments with racial symbolism, turning a disagreement about how much something cost into racialized conflict. It speaks to the internalization of this narrative in Black and Asian Americans. Even though our everyday life may not show many signs of racial hostility for the most part, our collective understanding of the social climate makes us contextualize each interaction as being yet another instance of this type of friction. In other words, no matter how many civil, normal, and even friendly interactions we see, the rare moments of hostility continue to act as confirmation of the narrative of conflict. It's what blows up in the discourse and what gets picked up for coverage in mainstream media. We hear endlessly about violence, but not about how Vietnamese immigrants were able to carve out a niche in nail salons, thanks in large part to the collaboration between a Vietnamese woman and a Black woman in LA. No disrespect to Tippi Hedren. Or how Black and Japanese activists came together to fight for the fair housing for their community's residents in Little Tokyo, who were being displaced for a commercial complex. These were just a couple of examples, but you get it. Clearly, there's more going on to this relationship than we tend to hear about.
It was like a Black and Japanese American neighborhood because of redlining. The Japanese American businesses were actually protected by African Americans.
That's why it's important to understand how and why these communities are so often pitted against each other. For instance, let's go back to that pin we left about the model minority. It was a term that conveniently arose during the civil rights movement. Many believe this was done purposefully to divide these communities, propping up Asian Americans as the good ones, just as civil rights leaders were threatening the status quo.
Model minority was coined by one such article from 1966. But this article, and others like it, didn't just cast Asian Americans as an obedient and respectful model minority. They also criticized so-called problem minorities, primarily Black Americans.
Asians who immigrated to the US and found success often bought into this characterization, not realizing this compliment was just a way to create a wedge between minority communities. At the same time, it caused other minority groups to feel resentful towards Asian Americans. We continue to see this as affirmative action has been used to create yet another point of contention, using Asian Americans as pawns to further the advantages of white college applicants.
I needed plaintiffs. I needed Asian plaintiffs.
There's a very purposeful misunderstanding of white supremacy that is always prominent in our media and conversations around race. They think white supremacy is about white people hating people of color, hating Black people, hating Asians. That's not what white supremacy is. White supremacy is a structural design to maintain a hierarchy where white people are on top. That is the gist of it. It happens without their consent, without their knowledge. That it purposely happens without their knowledge, because if they had to, most white people, if they had to directly engage with how the system is working for them and against other people, they wouldn't want to participate in it. That's what we're really talking about. And this is not a blame white people thing. This is a blame white supremacy thing. And until we are proactive in deconstructing and dismantling white supremacy, we're always going to have those conflicts arise in the community and in between communities, because we're all jockeying for positions to survive a system that doesn't really care if we survive or not.
This is something that's low-key reflected in Rush Hour. I swear, just hear me out. For all the cliches the series happily showcases, Rush Hour also surprises you every once in a while. Like in the first movie, we're told the big bad guy is Juntao, who we're led to believe is this guy. Here, the film definitely leans into tropes of Yellow Peril, as he represents an attack on the civility of the West via his East drug gang. It's something present throughout the franchise, as we get nameless, triad-adjacent Asian gangsters in each installment. But by the end of the first film, we learn it was actually a rich white guy puppeteering everything behind the scenes.
Every big crime has a rich white man behind it waiting for his cut.
This same reveal happens again in Rush Hour 3. Again, these were movies written by white guys. I keep mentioning who wrote the movies because they don't really toe the line between being funny and offensive that gracefully, which seems at odds with the fact that the film is generally remembered fondly by Black and Asian Americans.
Because it's not for white people. You think about it for a second. Everybody still likes it. So much of the woke discourse is poisoned by the overwhelming is of progressive politics and political discourse, in that white liberals are so invested in proving their inherent goodness, even if they're white. They're so invested in that dynamic that they will take shit that we are really not concerned about and elevate the highest levels of conflict-driven media discussions and ruin it for everybody so that they can kind of prove that they're good. You know what I'm saying? But because it's a movie for Black folks that Asians also like, because it's a movie that is not really for white people, a hood classic, they don't even know. They haven't bothered to discover it. And that's kind of why I think people don't care, is because we don't need, generally speaking, if it's just our shit, we already know. We already know there's conflict between Black folks and Asian communities. We already know that's a problem. We already know the conflict. We know that joke shouldn't exist, even then, right? But we also know that the battle isn't against that joke. It's against the structures that gives birth to that joke. It's the fact that we have an all-white writing team that had access to make the movies about Black and Asian experiences, and that Black and Asian creatives still to this day struggle to get their projects made. That's the real conflict area. So we're not even gonna bother. We're more focused on the real shit. That's my theory.
I think there's something to this. The franchise featured plenty of moments with a white gaze about Black and Asian people, but somewhere along the way, it tapped into the brotherhood that develops when people are in close proximity to each other for a long time. Knowing all of this, it becomes clearer why so many Black and Asian people still find Rush Hour enjoyable. For once, despite the world pitting us against each other, we get to see Asian and Black characters come together to form a legitimate camaraderie. And in Rush Hour, this camaraderie is forged through the sharing of cultures. Time and again, we see Lee and Carter absorb a bit of the other's cultural tendencies.
Kinda good. Need a little hot sauce, but it's kinda good though.
Truly love. Come on, check it out. Seems like yesterday we used to rock the show.
I can't leave you, Lee. Young you on your ponyo. Can't leave my brother.
There's an awkwardness to how they go about it, and it stems from the fact that in each film, at least one of them is a fish out of water.
Follow my lead and do what I do. What's up, my
What's up, my What did you just say?
In the first is Lee in America, and the second is Carter in China, and the third is both of them in France. Because of this, over the course of the franchise, the characters assume different roles in these new locations, and gain a better understanding of each other. While I wouldn't say this was a feat of writing genius, the franchise slowly began to subvert some of the racial assumptions it was leaning on. Lee and Carter first formed their bond through music, specifically in the iconic war scene. Over time, they rub off on each other and take a little bit of the other's personality and taste.
Ooh, Beach Boys is dope.
I love Beach Boys.
I mention this because it's very reminiscent in how Black and Asian communities have rubbed off on each other, exchanging and sharing aspects of each identity. We see this in things like sneaker collecting and hip-hop dance crews. And this happens inversely too, with the popularity of martial arts films and anime in the Black community, as well as the incorporation of Asian aesthetics throughout the course of hip-hop history. From the Wu-Tang Clan, Nicki Minaj, and Kendrick Lamar. Kendrick actually got his Kung Fu Kenny moniker from Don Cheadle's character in Rush Hour 2. I think Kung Fu Kenny is an interesting, if not over-the-top, example of this cultural melting pot effect. At first glance, this character seems like he's just someone exploiting Chinese culture for profit.
Kenny, you embarrassing yourself. You're a Black man with a Chinese restaurant on Crenshaw.
And I get that the joke is basically, look how ridiculous this Black guy looks doing all this Chinese stuff. But we find out he's learned the language, started a family with a Chinese wife, and even studied martial arts under a Chinese master. On the surface, it could be considered cultural appropriation. But I think the key that separates this from appropriation is a willing cultural exchange and a genuine appreciation for what's being shared.
So there's this conflict, but the movie was like, fuck all of that. Let's just have fun, right? This dude's funny. This dude does awesome stunts. Let's just party, because that is also quite possible between these communities. The conflicts are far too complex for me to try to unpack in this interview, but they exist, and at the same time, fun exists. And I think that's one thing that we often struggle with when we're talking about social issues and then using social issues to analyze and deconstruct media, is that the issue isn't 100% of the story. Two things can be true at once. And just because we observe a problem in these venues, it doesn't mean that these virtues can't exist in the same spot.
And contrary to what we've been led to believe, it's an experience much more common than conflict, something Professor Lee witnessed herself. Writing, having spent a great deal of time in neighborhoods like Harlem and West Philadelphia, I've witnessed far more prosaic and even humanizing encounters than conflicts between merchants and customers. For example, one Korean owner of a clothing store in Harlem is known by her Black employees and even some of her customers as Amma, which accurately describes her maternal nature. Encounters like this, often overlooked by the media in favor of headlines that portray racial warfare, also make up the fabric of commercial life in Black communities. Amid the warmth of some relationships and the antagonism of others, most merchants and customers agree that it's just business as usual, forging a commercial culture of reciprocity and respect. As it often happens, the truth is far more boring and complex than popular sensationalizations would have us believe. These communities have a long history together, filled with nuances that encapsulate everything from great solidarity to great animosity. It's neither this ongoing race war, nor is it a perfect relationship. There's a time and space to acknowledge these issues, and Rush Hour's humor doesn't come without its drawbacks. But sometimes, it's just nice to laugh at the absurdity of it all. It's so racist, but I don't know why I still enjoy it, even though 90% of it is racist against Asian people, but I still enjoy it. It's like a weird dynamic.
Because it exists in a pocket where racism doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So that's obviously problematic, right? That's obviously problematic, yada, 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 all the disclaimers. But also, man, it's nice to exist there sometimes.
You know, and it was that's how we felt on the set. We were so comfortable around each other because Jackie would mess up, I would mess up.
He cannot speak English.
And we was like both outsiders from Hollywood, you know.
Maybe Rush Hour didn't age well with some of its portrayals of race and masculinity, but somehow, at the core of this dumb action comedy franchise, it reflected the kinship that can form between outsiders of dominant culture. For just a few hours, we don't have to forget about the ongoing problems, but we can watch Black and Asian characters having fun and working together in spite of the wedges that aim to drive us apart. Hey, thanks for watching. I made this video because there's been little said about the Black and Asian dynamic outside of the well-reported history of conflict. And I've always thought this too broadly painted this relationship when there's just so much more going on. And as one of the few Asian American creators in this space, I wanted to portray this relationship in a different light and articulate my thoughts as best I could. Hopefully, I was able to do it justice by talking about this silly movie, and hopefully this video does well so I can keep talking about Asian American experiences. And special thanks to FD for taking the time to talk to me. If you want to see that full conversation, it's in our Patreon linked in our description. Either way, I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.